800 men stood in silence. No drums, no speeches, no hope of reinforcements. Only the wind moved, dragging dust across a battlefield that, within hours, would drink more blood than any of them could imagine. In front of them stretched an army so vast it seemed to bend the horizon itself. 30,000 Persians. Veterans, elite cavalry, archers in endless ranks, war chariots waiting like blades behind a clenched fist. Against them, 800 Macedonians, outnumbered nearly 40 to 1. By every known law of ancient warfare, this should not have been a battle. It should have been a massacre. And yet, this is not the story of how 800 men died. This is the story of how 30,000 lost everything in a single afternoon. Because what happened next was not just a victory, it was a collapse. A psychological implosion so violent and so sudden that historians would struggle for centuries to explain how it was even possible. And it all began with one decision, one gap, one blinding strike of calculated madness. A lightning strike into a weak flank shattered the entire defensive line. But to understand how something so impossible could ever happen, we must go back to the moment where defeat seemed inevitable and fear ruled both sides of the field. The Macedonian soldiers could see them clearly now, row after row, banner after banner, steel reflecting sunlight like a moving ocean. Some of the younger men whispered under their breath, others stared without blinking, as if their minds refused to accept the scale of what stood before them. This was not an army you defeat with courage alone. This was an army meant to erase smaller forces from history, and the Persians knew it. They had marched here not expecting resistance, but expecting surrender, because no rational commander would ever send 800 men against 30,000. No rational commander except one. At the center of the Macedonian formation rode a man barely into his 20s. His armor was dust-covered. His face was calm. Too calm. This was Alexander of Macedon, and on this day, he was about to gamble not only with his life, but with the future of his entire empire. Alexander was not supposed to be here. He was supposed to be consolidating power, crushing political rivals, securing his borders. Instead, he had chased destiny straight into the heart of the Persian war machine. Every advisor told him the same thing: you cannot win this battle. Every scout report made it worse. The enemy had more cavalry, more archers, more reserves, more experience fighting in massive formations. And worst of all, they had space. Open terrain, perfect for encirclement, a perfect killing field. One wrong move and the Macedonian force would not just be defeated, it would be erased. And Alexander knew it. That night before the battle, no fire burned in his camp. No celebration, no songs, only quiet calculations, only whispered doubts. Even his generals questioned him. Even his most loyal officers feared what was coming. Because what Alexander was planning to attempt had never been done before. Not at this scale. Not against these odds, not with so little margin for error. If his plan failed, there would be no retreat, only death. Across the field, the mood could not have been more different. The Persian commanders were not anxious, they were annoyed. Annoyed that such a tiny force had delayed them at all. Annoyed that this young Macedonian king still dared to challenge them after every warning. To the Persians, this battle was already over. This was not a confrontation. It was a formality. Their cavalry alone outnumbered the entire Macedonian army many times over. Their center was solid. Their flanks were wide. Their reserves stretched so deep they could rotate fresh troops endlessly. They did not need brilliance. They only needed pressure. Slow, relentless, crushing. By midday, they expected Alexander's name to be nothing more than another footnote in the long list of men who underestimated Persia. They did not yet understand that numbers mean nothing when control vanishes. As dawn broke, the battlefield fell into an unnatural quiet. No horns, no arrows, just movement. The Macedonian line advanced slowly, shields locked, spears forward. The Persians did not rush to meet them. They waited, letting the smaller force exhaust itself, letting fear do its work. And it was working. Every step forward felt heavier than the last, because every Macedonian soldier understood something terrifyingly simple. They were walking into a wall that could not be broken by force, not by size, not by strength, not by endurance, only by something far more dangerous: a mistake. And somewhere along the Persian front, that mistake was already forming, though no one yet realized it. Then Alexander did something no one expected. He shifted his formation, not backward, not defensive. He pulled his best troops not to the center but to one side, to the right. It was subtle, almost invisible at first, a small change in alignment, a minor adjustment in spacing. But to trained eyes, it was madness. By doing this, Alexander was exposing his own center, inviting the Persians to drive straight through him. One full push, and his army would be split in two, surrounded, destroyed. His generals saw it. Their blood ran cold. This was not courage. This was suicidal geometry. Unless Alexander was not trying to survive the battle, unless he was trying to end it instantly. As the Macedonian right began to edge outward, the Persian left responded, slowly, confidently, exactly as Alexander expected. They extended their line to match him, wider and wider, and in doing so, they created it. A fraction of space, a tiny distortion in the perfect Persian formation. Not a hole, not yet, just a weakness. A place where movement was not synchronized, where commands lagged by seconds, where alignment was imperfect. It was invisible to thousands of eyes, but not to one. Alexander watched it form, and when it was finally wide enough for reality to slip through, he gave the order, and the battlefield exploded. The order passed through the Macedonian line without sound, no battle cry, no roar, only movement. The right flank surged forward, not in chaos, but in brutal precision. Shields slammed together, spears angled low, boots struck the earth in perfect rhythm. The Persians reacted instantly. Their left flank began to advance, exactly as planned. They were confident. They believed Alexander had exposed himself. They believed they were about to tear the Macedonian army in half. And for a brief moment, they were right. The first impact was not dramatic. It was brutal. Wood shattered. Bronze screamed. Men vanished beneath shields and hooves. Persian cavalry slammed into the forward Macedonian units, trying to punch through with raw momentum. But Alexander had anticipated this. His men did not resist the push. They absorbed it, bent with it, let the Persian force sink inward. To the watching Persian commanders, this looked like collapse. The Macedonian center was giving way. Their line was buckling, exactly as expected. The Persian officers raised their arms. They ordered the full pressure forward. This was the killing moment. This was where the Macedonian army should have broken forever. But something was wrong. The Macedonian center did not break. It compressed. Instead of retreating in panic, the men locked tighter, shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield. They gave ground slowly, on purpose, drawing the Persian force deeper, pulling them inward like a trap being gently closed. Every step back was calculated. Every loss was paid for in Persian blood. The Persians did not realize they were advancing into a narrowing corridor. They believed they were winning because they could not yet see the walls forming around them. On the right, Alexander rode with his elite cavalry, the best riders, the heaviest armor, the sharpest spears. He did not charge yet. He waited, watching the Persian line stretch thinner with every adjustment, watching officers scream orders as formations strained to stay connected, watching delay ripple through their ranks like cracks through ice. This battle was no longer about strength. It was about timing. Alexander was counting heartbeats, not seconds, because once he committed, there would be no stopping the momentum and no undoing the decision. The Persian left wing pushed harder. They wanted to crush the exposed Macedonian side before the center could stabilize. Their cavalry fanned outward too far. Their infantry chased the illusion of a full collapse too deep. And their officers, confident in superiority, made the fatal assumption that Alexander was desperate, that this was his last stand. They did not consider the possibility that he was still setting the board. To an untrained observer, the battlefield still looked even. Two masses colliding, dust rising, men shouting, steel flashing. But to Alexander, the geometry had finally shifted. The Persian left and center were no longer aligned. Their forces were no longer mutually supporting. There was now a difference in pressure, a difference in response time, a difference that existed for only a few seconds and would never return. Alexander lifted his spear, and the men around him understood. This was it. There was no trumpet, no warning. Alexander spurred his horse forward. The elite cavalry launched as a single body, not wide, not scattered, but as a narrow, brutal wedge, a living spear aimed directly at the weak seam between the Persian left and center. The speed was terrifying. Persian archers released a final volley in panic. Most of the arrows missed. Some struck armor and fell uselessly. And then the Macedonian wedge hit. This was not a normal collision. This was focused annihilation. The Persian units at the seam were not prepared for a direct shock. They were stretched, mid-command, mid-adjustment. The Macedonian cavalry punched through their front rank like glass. Men flew backward, horses collided, shields shattered inward. For 3 seconds, the Persian line did not understand what had happened. Then it understood all at once. The seam ruptured, the formation split, and the entire Persian left flank began to lose cohesion. Not retreat, not yet, but control. Persian officers screamed to close the gap, but commands could not move faster than fear. The soldiers closest to the rupture felt something unnatural. Air behind them. Space where allies should have been. And space on a battlefield means only one thing: death. They began to turn, not to flee, but to look. And that was enough. The Macedonian cavalry poured deeper into the opening. They did not slow down. They did not spread out. They drove straight through the Persian interior like a blade through fabric. And behind them, the Macedonian center stopped retreating and began to advance. What had looked like a collapse moments earlier was now a double-sided compression. The Persian units that had pushed too deep suddenly found themselves trapped between advancing Macedonian infantry from the front and Alexander's cavalry ripping through their rear. Shields no longer faced the enemy. They faced each other. Officers died trying to reorganize. Messengers were cut down before their words could be understood. The Persian army had not yet been defeated, but its structure had been wounded, and structure is everything. The Persian left did not collapse all at once. It unraveled, thread by thread, unit by unit, man by man. At first, it was only hesitation. A cavalry squad pulling back without orders, an infantry block slowing its advance, an officer shouting commands that no one seemed able to hear. Then it became contradiction. One unit pushed forward while another pulled back. Archers continued firing into a space that was no longer protected. Cavalry tried to charge through lanes that no longer existed. The Persian left was still physically intact, but mentally it had already fractured. Alexander was no longer attacking the Persian army. He was inside it. His cavalry wedge tore straight through the rear ranks, cutting supply lines, messengers, and command nodes apart in seconds. Persian runners fell before they could relay orders. Officers turned to find that the units they were directing no longer existed where they were supposed to be. Formation maps in their minds no longer matched the battlefield. The Persian army was blind, and blindness is more lethal than fear. Persian command relied on mass coordination, signals, drums, visual alignment. It worked perfectly when the line was stable. But once the Macedonian wedge broke through, those systems failed instantly. Orders were still being issued for formations that had already collapsed. Cavalry was being sent to reinforce positions that no longer existed. And worst of all, no one at Persian headquarters yet understood the scale of what had happened. They believed they were still winning the center. They believed the Macedonians were still in full retreat. They were wrong. By the time the truth reached them, the truth was already unstoppable. At the heart of the Persian army, the main infantry mass was still pushing forward. They were committed. They had momentum. They believed victory was minutes away. And then they felt it. Not from the front, from the side. Pressure where there should have been support. Movement where there should have been reinforcement. Shouting where there should have been structure. They began to glance left, and what they saw made no sense. Persian banners were moving backward, not in formation, in fragments. The left flank was not retreating, it was disintegrating. Fear does not spread evenly. It jumps. From the first man who breaks to the next who notices, then the next, then the next. In moments, hundreds felt it, a realization more powerful than any weapon. We are no longer protected. That single thought is enough to destroy an army. Units that had never been touched by Macedonian steel yet began to step backward, not in surrender, in instinct. They were no longer reacting to commands. They were reacting to survival. This was the moment Alexander had been waiting for. The signal reached the Macedonian infantry. The center stopped yielding and began to push, not cautiously, not defensively. They advanced with full weight, spears driving forward, shields slamming, men stepping over bodies without slowing. To the Persians in front of them, it was like the dead had suddenly risen and begun to fight back. The pressure reversed, and for the first time in the battle, the Persians were the ones being compressed. Behind the Persian left, Alexander wheeled his cavalry around, no longer driving forward, now turning inward. They struck the Persian units from the rear and side simultaneously. This was not a fight. It was an execution of formation. Persian soldiers tried to turn, but turning meant exposing their backs to the Macedonian center. They were trapped between two advancing walls, spears from the front, swords from behind. There was no safe direction to face. The Persian left did not retreat. It collapsed inward, like a structure whose internal supports had been cut. Men dropped shields to run. Cavalry abandoned horses to squeeze through infantry gaps. Officers vanished beneath crowds. And in that surge of uncontrolled movement, the Persian left ceased to function as a military unit. It became a fleeing mass. The moment one flank breaks, an army is no longer an army. It is only a crowd holding weapons. The Persian center felt the collapse almost immediately. Pressure from the left vanished, then returned violently inward. The line warped, the center bent. Commanders screamed for order, but order requires time, and time no longer existed on the battlefield. Panic from the left flowed into the center like fire into dry grass. Men who had not seen Alexander, men who had not been touched by Macedonian blades, men who were still physically winning their local fight, began to retreat anyway, because the structure around them was dying. The Persian army had been built on superiority, on certainty, on inevitability. Now, for the first time that day, they felt the opposite: uncertainty, confusion, and a single question echoed through thousands of minds at once. How are we losing? No one could answer it fast enough. At last, messengers reached the high command, breathless, bleeding, terrified. They did not deliver reports, they delivered reality. The left flank is gone. Alexander is behind our lines. The center is breaking. For a few seconds, the Persian commanders refused to accept it. 30,000 men do not break because of 800. That is not how the world works. And yet the world, at that moment, was doing exactly that. Emergency commands were issued. Pull the center back, reform on the right, send reserves, close the breach. But every order had a fatal flaw. It arrived to units that were no longer synchronized. The Persian army was now moving at different emotional speeds. Some were still fighting, some were retreating. Some were already fleeing. No command can unify forces that no longer share the same state of mind. Then it happened. A full Persian unit, not broken, not surrounded, turned and ran. Not back in order, but in panic. They collided with retreating units from the left. The impact rippled. More men turned, then more. Then hundreds, then thousands. The Persian army did not lose a battle in that moment. It lost belief in itself. And belief is the final defense of any force. From behind the Persian lines, Alexander saw the wave forming, the moment where retreat would turn into disaster. He did not slow his men. He drove them forward, harder, faster, relentlessly, not allowing the Persians time to reorganize, not allowing the panic to stabilize. This was the moment where mercy would be catastrophic. Only pressure could finish it. The Persian center was still fighting, still pushing, still killing, but it was now fighting without context, without protection on its flank, without certainty behind its back, without trust in what surrounded it. Thousands of men were still locked in brutal hand-to-hand combat with the Macedonian infantry. They did not yet know that the war they were fighting no longer existed. The Macedonian center pushed harder. Every step forward was paid for in blood. But now the Persians could not rotate fresh troops. They could not shift weight from the left. They could not stabilize their formation. The left was gone, and the center was now carrying the full weight of the battlefield alone. Their line grew denser. More bodies packed into less space. Shields overlapped too tightly. Spears tangled. Movement slowed. And slow movement on a battlefield is death. At first, the battlefield had sounded like structure, organized shouting, rhythmic clashes, commanded movement. Now something else crept in. Screams. Not war cries, not commands. Screams of men who suddenly saw behind the illusion. Men who realized too late that they were surrounded by disorder. Men who understood that the collapse had already passed them by. The sound of the battlefield had shifted from war to catastrophe. It starts with one man, one Persian infantryman near the rear of the center. He pushes his shield forward, steps, then hears something behind him that does not belong. Hooves, shouting in Macedonian. He glances back and sees Alexander's cavalry cutting through retreating Persian units like a storm made of steel. Not advancing, hunting. In that moment, his shield becomes meaningless. His spear becomes irrelevant. The idea of formation disappears, and he turns, not in retreat, in terror. Once a center turns to look backward, it is already lost. Those behind collide with those still fighting. Men stumble over wounded comrades, spears drop, gaps appear, and gaps are invitations. The Macedonian infantry does not hesitate. They surge forward into the openings, shield walls break apart. Persian officers attempt to restore order, but they are now pushing against a tide that is flowing in two directions at once, some still attacking, some already running. And no army can exist in two emotional states at the same time. It does not happen with a great signal. It happens in fragments. A unit pulls back too fast. Another hesitates. A third panics. And suddenly the weight that once pressed forward begins to move backward. The Persian center does not retreat in formation. It breaks in sections like a cracked dam. Water surges through the first breach, then tears the rest apart. As the center collapses inward, the battlefield expands outward. What had been compressed violence becomes scattered chaos. Persian soldiers run in clusters. Some drop weapons to move faster. Others try to form defensive knots. Some attempt to fight their way through Macedonian lines in blind desperation. But Alexander has already seen this moment before it happened. He does not recall his cavalry. He splits it. Small strike groups fan outward across the fleeing mass, not chasing blindly, targeting leaders, targeting rally points, targeting any place where order might still be reborn. His goal is no longer victory. Victory is already inevitable. His goal is finality. to make sure this army never reforms, never regains morale, never recovers its sense of self. Now the numbers finally mean nothing. 30,000 men do not move as one. They move as thousands of individuals, all wanting the same impossible thing: to survive the next minute. The battlefield has become a living organism in panic. Some run into open ground, some toward ravines, some straight into Macedonian patrols without realizing it. There is no longer a front. There is no longer a rear. Only danger in every direction. Some Persian units on the far right are still intact, still armed, still untouched by Macedonian weapons. They look across the field and cannot understand what they are seeing. They see men they outnumber turning and fleeing. They see banners falling. They see cavalry charges moving the wrong way. For a brief moment, they consider advancing to restore order, to strike the Macedonians while they are scattered. But then the panic reaches them. Not physically, emotionally. And when panic reaches even untouched units, the battle is already over. The Persian army is no longer an army, it is a river of flight. And rivers do not argue with gravity. They only flow. Men shove past each other, horses crash into infantry, wounded are trampled, armor becomes a burden. Some die without ever seeing the enemy who killed their formation. For the Macedonian soldiers, the change is unreal. Moments ago, they were dying to hold ground. Now the enemy is fleeing in every direction. They advance in disbelief at first, then in understanding, then in triumph. Their shouts rise not of fear, of victory. They had not just survived. They had broken an empire's field army against every law of warfare, against every rational expectation, against 30,000 with 800. Dust clouds hang in the air like fog. The sun is half hidden behind dirt and smoke. The ground is layered with fallen men, broken shields, abandoned weapons. This is no longer a battlefield. It is the aftermath of something that should not have been possible. And yet, it happened. Alexander does not call off the pursuit. He knows this lesson must be carved into memory, not only into Persian memory, into the memory of the world. His cavalry rides until horses collapse, until arms can no longer lift blades, until the fleeing becomes scattered beyond recovery. The battlefield no longer had a front, it had a direction, and that direction was away from Alexander. The Persian army was not retreating anymore, it was fleeing. The first rule of pursuit is simple. You do not chase what is still organized, you chase what has forgotten who it is. Alexander understood this better than anyone. His cavalry did not scatter in blind excitement, they divided with intent. Each group assigned a vector of flight, each charge aimed not to kill indiscriminately, but to prevent regrouping. Every time a Persian unit tried to slow and reform, the Macedonians hit it again from the side, from behind, from angles that made shields useless. The message became unavoidable. There would be no second stand. There would be no recovery. There would only be survival or capture. What followed was not a battle. It was distance measured in corpses. Persian soldiers dropped weapons to run faster, then dropped armor, then dropped even the thought of fighting back. Some ran until their lungs failed. Some ran until horses collapsed beneath them. Some ran until panic drove them into ravines, rivers, and dead ends. The land itself became the final enemy, and it killed without mercy. Fear does not make people slow. It makes them irrational. Persian cavalry crashed into their own infantry. Infantry shoved wounded comrades aside to escape. Men who had marched in perfect formation hours earlier now ran in screaming clusters. There was no coordination left to destroy, because there was no coordination left at all. The discipline that once made the Persian army unstoppable now made its collapse catastrophic. Alexander's strike groups did not hunt randomly. They hunted command. Any cluster that showed signs of leadership was targeted immediately. A man standing too tall, a banner still held upright, a voice giving orders. Each one became a beacon of death. Because if leadership survived, The army might someday remember itself, and Alexander would not allow that. Far from the original impact zone, some Persian forces had never faced direct combat. Their weapons were clean. Their formations, hours earlier, had still been intact. Yet they too began to flee, not because Macedonians reached them, but because panic always arrives before the enemy. They saw the storm moving across the field. They saw the survivors running. They heard the screaming, and they understood what logic could not explain. This battle was cursed, and any man who remained inside it would not leave. At some point during the pursuit, the numbers stopped mattering at all. Not 800, not 30,000, not thousands fleeing, only individuals struggling through dust and blood. Each Persian soldier was now alone inside the largest defeat of his civilization. And in moments of absolute collapse, history stops counting armies and starts counting deaths. News of disaster always travels faster than truth. Scattered Persian survivors began to reach outposts, cities, road stations, border garrisons. They brought no coherent reports, only fragments, only terror. The army is gone. Alexander is everywhere. There is no line anymore. The shock wave of the defeat moved ahead of the Macedonians like a second army made of fear, and it destroyed resistance before Alexander even arrived. At some point in the chaos, the realization finally settled across the fleeing mass. This had not been a normal general. This had not been a normal battle. This had not been a normal defeat. They had not fought a man who wanted to win. They had fought a man who wanted to rewrite the rules of power. And they had lost under his laws, not theirs. For the Macedonian soldiers, the victory was not immediately triumphant. At first, it was disorienting. They had prepared to die. They had prepared for slaughter. They had prepared for annihilation. Instead, they had annihilated. They looked across the field at what 30,000 defeated men looked like, and struggled to comprehend how they had survived it. Then understanding gave way to belief, and belief turned into something dangerous. Legend. Hours earlier, fear had lived only in the Macedonian ranks. Now it lived entirely in Persian hearts. And fear is never neutral. It reshapes everything around it. Persian garrisons would later surrender at the sight of Macedonian banners. Cities would open gates without a siege. Armies would hesitate where once they would have charged. Because fear had learned a new name, Alexander. By the time the sun began to sink, the pursuit slowed, not because the Persians had escaped, but because there were no formations left to destroy. The field behind the Macedonians was silent. The field ahead of them was empty. And somewhere between those two spaces, an empire had lost its sense of inevitability forever. When the dust finally settled, one question remained suspended over the battlefield like smoke. How could 800 men destroy an army nearly 40 times their size? This was not luck, not coincidence, not divine intervention. This was the result of 5 overlapping forces that aligned in a single catastrophic moment. And once they aligned, no number on earth could stop the outcome. The Persians had 30,000 men. But they did not have 30,000 minds moving as one. They had delays in command, layered hierarchies, dependence on synchronized movement across vast distances. That system works only under one condition: perfect stability. The moment Alexander ruptured the line, the Persian army stopped being a single force and became thousands of disconnected decisions. An army is not defined by size. It is defined by how many men can obey the same order at the same time. On that battlefield, Alexander controlled more minds than the Persian commanders ever did. Alexander did not attack the army. He attacked its geometry. He did not seek maximum casualties, slow pressure, attritional victory. He sought one error in spatial alignment, one seam, one flaw in timing, one place where motion was imperfect. Once he found it, he did not fight forward. He sliced inward, not to defeat the Persian left, but to disconnect it from the center. The moment the line lost continuity, The battle was already mathematically over. It just took time for reality to catch up. The most brilliant deception of the battle was not on the right. It was in the Macedonian center. What the Persians interpreted as collapse was controlled compression. Alexander allowed his center to bend without breaking. This convinced them victory was imminent, pulled them deeper than they realized, and stole their ability to respond laterally. By the time the Persians realized the center had not truly failed, they were too deep to escape. The Persian command structure was designed for dominance, not for shock. Once panic began, orders arrived slower than fear, and fear always moves faster than language. By the time Persian headquarters understood what had happened, the men who needed the orders most were already gone. No army can recover from that asymmetry. Most commanders stop when the enemy retreats. Alexander did not. He understood one truth that few men in history ever fully grasp. A defeated enemy today can become a dangerous enemy tomorrow. A psychologically annihilated enemy never returns. The pursuit was not about killing survivors. It was about killing the idea of resistance. And it worked. The Persian defeat was not caused by one mistake. It was caused by 5 mistakes overlapping in the same place. Overconfidence in numbers, overextension of the left, inflexible command structure, failure to understand Alexander's intent, and slow reaction to psychological collapse. None of these alone would have been fatal. Together, they produced disaster. Alexander did not see armies as blocks. He saw them as flows of pressure, vectors of fear, fragile networks of trust. He did not ask, "How do I defeat this army?" He asked, "Where does it become fragile?" And on that battlefield, he found the answer with surgical precision. This was not a tactical win. It was a strategic earthquake. After this battle, everything changed. Persian commanders no longer trusted numbers. Cities no longer trusted walls. Armies no longer trusted that size meant safety. The psychological architecture of the ancient world cracked, and Alexander walked through it. The most terrifying part is not that Alexander won. It is that from his perspective, this battle went almost exactly as planned, which means the impossible was not an accident. It was repeatable. The battlefield was quiet again, not the silence of anticipation, but the silence that comes only after something irreversible has happened. The dust slowly settled. The screams faded. And what remained on the ground was no longer an army, but the shadow of one. There is a difference between losing and being erased. Scattered across the plain were shields without owners, banners without meaning, weapons dropped not in surrender, but in exhaustion. The Persian army had not merely been beaten, it had been unmade. Its structure had collapsed, its command had vanished, its belief in itself had shattered. And belief, once broken at that scale, rarely reforms. Alexander walked the field not as a conqueror, not as a god, but as a man measuring consequences. He saw his own dead, he saw the cost that even victory demanded, and he understood something most kings never do. Power is not proven by how many you rule. It is proven by how many no longer dare to oppose you. The survivors spread faster than Alexander ever could, along roads, through villages, across borders. Each carried a different version of the same truth. We were everywhere and suddenly nowhere. Victory was in our hands, and then it was gone. He did not fight like other kings. He did not fight like a man at all. By the time Alexander reached the next city, fear had already arrived, and fear opened more gates than any siege engine ever built. Before this day, warfare was about size, supply, endurance, slow dominance. After this day, it became about timing, psychology, shock, collapse. Generals would study formations, but they would fear flanks. Kings would raise vast armies, but they would fear commanders. Empires would still measure power in numbers, but secretly they would measure it in minds. Because minds, once broken, cannot be counted. Before this battle, Alexander was a rising power. After it, he became a force of inevitability. Men did not ask, "Can we stop him?" They asked, "How long until he arrives?" His enemies no longer planned wars, they planned delays. And delays are confessions of fear. The most dangerous weapon in human history is not a sword, not an army, not even an empire. It is the belief that something is unstoppable. On that battlefield, that belief changed sides. And once it did, the ancient world would never recover its balance. 800 men walked onto a field expecting extinction. They walked off it as proof that there is no such thing as an unbreakable force, only forces that have not yet met the right moment. The Persians had numbers, they had experience, they had superiority. But Alexander had something rarer: the ability to see where reality would fracture, and the courage to strike that point without hesitation. History does not belong to the many, it belongs to the decisive. To those who understand that timing beats strength, disruption beats endurance, psychology beats steel. 30,000 men learned that in a single afternoon, and the world learned it for the rest of time. Some victories expand borders, others expand legends. This one did both. From this day forward, Alexander would no longer be measured by what he conquered. He would be measured by what no one dared to defend. If you want more battles where the impossible collapses in real time, where empires fall not to size but to one decision, then stay with us. Because history does not run out of impossible moments. We just decide which ones we remember.